Thank you for joining us today, Andrea. It's really great to have you with us.
Thank you, Emmy. Great to be here. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. And I'm honoured as well. I saw the interview that you did with Seth Godin as well. I'm honoured that you're on the podcast, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you because I read the book and it's absolutely brilliant. Obviously, I would say that to your face, but genuinely 10 pages of notes I took whilst I was reading that. So not only for the purposes of the podcast, but for the people that are listening, there's masses of value in there.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And with Seth, for me, was a huge privilege and honor to be able to have a conversation with him a few months ago.
On the book, then, can we talk about how you got to the point of writing the book? Where did the inspiration come from?
Sure. I wrote it because when it comes to public speaking, presenting, so the title of the book is Confident Presenter, and there is a reason for that, because many people think that confidence in presenting comes from either natural talent, innate self-belief, or some people think that it comes from wishful thinking. Well, it has nothing to do with that. Confidence comes from three things. Number one, familiarity and preparation. The more familiar you are with doing certain things, including, for example, presenting, speaking in public, the more confident you become at doing those things. Now, for example, Emmy, some time ago, I watched the video, was an interview with Kobe Bryant. I don't know if you know him, one of the best NBA players, basketball players of all time. Unfortunately, he passed away some time ago. But the one question was, Kobe, how is it possible that every time I see you playing, you always look so confident? And he said, the only reason why you think I'm confident is because when you see me doing certain things, I've done those things 1,000 times before. Confidence comes from familiarity and preparation. And the same is true when it comes to presenting, communicating our ideas. It also comes from following a certain process. There's a structured way of thinking about presenting, which goes beyond just opening up PowerPoint and putting together some slides, which, believe it or not, is the very first thing most people do, including a lot of CEOs, MDs, and business leaders as well. So there's a structured way of thinking about presenting, and we can talk about it in more detail if you want. And also, and this is the focus of my book, I think that 80%, maybe not 100%, but 80% of your confidence comes from your ability to develop a compelling message. So it's not really about your delivery skills. Again, when people think about public speaking, they think about things like body language, gestures, eye contact. These are all important things, but where confidence really comes from is whether or not you have the ability to craft a captivating message. Without a story that resonates with the audience, it doesn't matter how good you are from a delivery perspective. And so then to answer your question, the reason why I wrote the book is because I think there is a misunderstanding when it comes to what it takes to become a confident presenter. And I hope that in a small way, my book is part of the answer to that misunderstanding.
Absolutely. There's loads of tips in there. There's so much insight that you shared in there that will help people. I'm absolutely confident. And so the reason for the writing the book is clear, but tell us about the impact that the book's had, because littered throughout the book there are case studies of people that you've helped through your organisation Ideas on Stage. But talk to us about the impact that the book's had on people. Do you get that feedback?
There are a few things. Perhaps even beyond some, as you mentioned, some of the examples and case studies I've included in the book. For me, one of the, and I don't like to talk about like my successes or the success of the book, but because you asked, one of the most interesting things that happened, it was the day after I published the book, I got contacted by a professor at New York University. It was the day after, and he said, look, I just saw your book and I love it. I don't know when he read it, maybe like at night. And then to make the story short, they then decided to officially use Confident Presenter, my book, as part of their recommended reading for all their business communication students. I've been invited to give a couple of seminars for the students. And like for me, like New York University, I would have never believed that was the case. And then beyond that, yes, in the book there are case studies from like small business leaders applying certain principles, because in the book I go through some fundamental principles of communication and how we can apply them specifically in the context of presenting our ideas. And so both in terms of that, like one person applying those principles, but also there are some case studies and examples for business leaders who wanted to develop a team of confident communicators. So it's not just one person who wants to improve their general presentation skills, but often we're talking about managing directors, CEOs, and business leaders for whom it's important to develop a team of confident communicators.
And that's the reason for the podcast, that as much as I've really enjoyed the book, it is the audience of this podcast is very much business leaders, CEOs, people that want to be in those positions of leadership. And so can you talk us through, and this is going to be hard because I'm going to want to jump in because I really enjoyed the book, but can you talk us through some of the concepts in the book? So, for example, if you start with the P score.
Sure. Yeah. So P score or presentation score, that's the method that we use when we work with our clients. And score stands for 5 principles. So we say that when you give a presentation, for example, it's like in football, you want to score, like when you score a goal. And score stands for 5 principles. In the book, I go through each of these 5 principles in detail with practical tips on how to implement it. And the 5 principles are simple, clear, original, related to the audience, and enjoyable. These are the 5 key principles for powerful communication. Now, if you want, Amy, what I can do for now, I can talk about perhaps one of the 5 principles, the one that I think is the most important one. But then I'm happy to explore all the others, whatever you prefer. So if we think about these 5 principles, the R stands for related, which means related to the audience. And it goes back to the idea that many people start their presentations simply by just opening up PowerPoint and putting together some slides. And we know that that's not the very first thing you want to do. When you give a presentation, you are communicating with someone. And so you need to start with them. When you give a presentation, it's always their presentation, not yours. It's always the audience's presentation. Think of a presentation as a present. If I want to give you a present, Emmy, it's your present, not mine. And so I need to make sure that I know you so that I can buy something that you like. A presentation is very similar. When you give people a presentation, it's their presentation, not yours. And so you need to make sure that you know your audience, definitely before you open up PowerPoint, but also before you start thinking about your key messages, what you want to communicate. And to do that, there is a practical framework that I discuss in the book. That's what we use. That's the framework I use when I prepare my own presentations. We follow the same framework when we work with the clients. We call it the ABC of preparation. Audience, burning needs, context. ABC. So which means that before you do anything else, you need to take some time and ask yourself some questions about the audience. Who are they? Their burning needs. What do they really need? What do they expect from your presentation? And also the context. For example, is it one-to-one? Is it one-to-many? If it's one-to-many, how many? Is it in person? Is it online? If it's online, what tool are you going to use? How are you going to use it? What's the duration of that presentation or meeting? Now, don't get me wrong, Emmy. I'm not saying that if you don't do that, then you can't create a great presentation. You can. But the risk is that you develop a fantastic presentation, but for the wrong audience. And if you want, I don't want to go too long. I have an example from one of our clients that illustrates this point effectively. But again, I'll just give it back to you just in case you want to take the conversation somewhere else. Otherwise, I can share an example.
Absolutely, go for it. I think it's this kind of stuff. So the book is very practical. There's lots of practical tips in there, and that ABC is one of those things that I've personally taken from from the book. So feel free to share. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
So some time ago, we worked with a client. Her name is Marie from Paris. Marie is an executive. She's an expert in leadership. And she was invited by an association in Finland to give a talk about leadership. And she was super excited. It was one of her first international speaking opportunities. And so she prepared really well. She knew her message. She told us that she had prepared 50 beautiful slides. And also, she practiced well. So she was ready to go. She flew to Finland the day before the conference, then arrived there on the day, half an hour before the audience, because she wanted to make sure that she had time to set things up. And when she was about to connect her laptop to the screen, she realized that there was no screen. So a little bit of panic, she went and asked the organizers, assuming that they would say, "Oh, sorry, Marie, now we are going to fix this for you." But what they did instead was they started laughing. And so she says, "Why are you laughing?" And they say, "Look, Marie, you want to show 50 slides, but actually you've been invited to give a talk to the association in Finland of blind people." Blind people. Now, Emmy, I know it's an extreme example. It sounds like a bad joke, but it happened for real. You see, Marie was very well prepared, apart from one thing. She didn't know her audience. She didn't even take the time to translate the name of the association from Finnish to French, and she would have realized that perhaps there was no need to have 50 beautiful slides. So the message here is that if you want to make sure, you should want to make sure that your presentations are related, one of the 5 principles, relevant to the audience. Before you do anything else, you always need to start with them, with the audience.
A great story, which links into the next point in terms of telling the stories to make the point stick. And I'm paraphrasing, but in terms of the analogies that you use through the book, you said that the use of analogies is really powerful. Can you share a little bit about why, please?
Absolutely. Analogies are one of the most powerful things one of the most powerful communication devices we can use for us to support our key messages, to make sure that our messages are understood and remembered. The reason why that happens is because every time you connect, by the way, just in case somebody is not familiar with this, an analogy is a comparison between two things. When we say this is a bit like that, A is a bit like B, where A is your idea, your concept, B is something else. And that something else has nothing to do with A, with the other thing. When we make that connection, that's when learning happens. So every time you have an idea, especially when it's technical or complex, or if it's something if it's a concept or an idea, a strategy, whatever it is that you want to communicate that may be new to the audience, every time you connect that to something that the audience already knows and understand, that's when they remember it, that's when they understand it. I interviewed for our podcast, the Ideas on Stage podcast, the author of a book on the power of analogies, Shortcut. And now he's John Pollock. John Pollock, by the way, he used to be one of the speech writers for Bill Clinton. He wrote this book, Shortcut. And he says that the best way to explain something new is to attach it, to connect it to something that the audience already knows and understands.
And so there was an analogy that you used in the book to reinforce that. John used an analogy in an interview.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. John, yeah. I even forgot that. So thank you for reading the book. I even forgot that I had included John in the book. Yes. So he shared that story so this is a mix of story and an analogy when I interviewed him on the podcast. And he said that that was the interview for him to start working at the White House, to be part of the speechwriters team of Bill Clinton. And And he started in on his CV. He had included something that didn't look super professional, like building a boat with bottle like wine corks, and so the interview was not going well. And then I don't remember exactly what the analogy was, but the idea was that at the end he did use an analogy, and he compared that passion project to something which was very much connected to speech writing. I think he said something like, well, if you think about it, building a boat is a bit like crafting a speech, because when you build a boat like I'm doing now with bottle corks, you have a lot of like things which are not connected to each other, the corks, and then you assemble them and they take you on a journey. You never know where it takes you. And it's similar to when you write a speech. You take words that perhaps individually have nothing to do with each other, but when you assemble them together, much like you do when you assemble all the things to build a boat, then even a speech can take you on an amazing journey, something along those lines. And thanks to the analogy, the recruiter got it, and the rest is his history. He became one of the speech writers for Bill Clinton. That's the power of an analogy.
Absolutely, and a great example to share. Thank you for that. And in terms of a question that I wanted to ask, obviously, having read the book, I've got an opinion on this, but I really wanted to understand whether you felt that there are born presenters. I know it's a skill that everybody can learn after reading the book. I probably wouldn't have believed it before I read the book, but I know it's a skill that people can hone. But do you think there are people that are born with an innate ability to present and conduct public speaking?
I think, and this is what I see every day with speakers at conferences with our clients, there are definitely people for whom speaking in public, presenting comes more naturally, and it works like the starting point. So the starting point for people is different. Yes, there are people who struggle a lot for different reasons, like public speaking nerves and many other obstacles, whereas others, the starting point is a bit higher. But regardless of what the starting point is, it's possible for anyone to become better at this thing. This is like learning any other skill. Public speaking, the specificity of public speaking is that it's a skill that requires knowledge and technique. So it's not just knowledge, you need knowledge and technique. It's a bit like learning how to play a new musical instrument. You need knowledge and technique as well. And every time you want to develop something, a skill that has this combination of knowledge and technique, then what really makes a difference is practice. Even when we work with our clients, yes, often what we do is we start a journey together, but then what really makes a difference is whether or not they keep practicing certain principles and certain techniques. Otherwise, without practice, nothing happens.
As you talked towards the end of the book about the power of rehearsing and the difference between what you class as rehearsing and what most people class as rehearsing. So if I think back to my early career was teaching English in Japan, and if I think back to that first lesson, it was terrible. But then at the end of the year, I can't say I was great, but I was better, definitely better. But when I think about rehearsing, it's almost kind of having a run through in my mind, and then maybe you flick through the slides, and maybe you might say the words out loud. I never actually went to the extent that you talk about in the book, which is going and actually conducting the speech in front of people that can give you feedback. So can you talk a little bit about that? What should we be doing if we're rehearsing for public speaking?
So there's a difference between practice and rehearsing. Practicing and rehearsing are two different things, and they should be separated. Both things are important, but they're different. So practicing means, for example, as you said, Emmy, thinking about what to say. I've got this presentation coming up. Maybe I created some slides. Perfect. I open up my laptop, I check my slides, and I start thinking, okay, on this slide, I will be talking about this. And here I will be talking about that. And then maybe, again, as you said, maybe you start repeating a little bit. As you do, maybe you realize that the flow is not quite right, so you need to change something, and you go back. So, And that's a practice session, and that's important. But rehearsing is a different level of preparation, and that's what great presenters do. Rehearsing means repeating your presentation out loud, not in your head, out loud from the very beginning to the very end without stopping. As if, even if you don't have it, but as if there is a real audience in front of you. And you want to do that several times. That's what great presenters do. Another thing that great presenters do is, whenever possible, they rehearse in the real world, like in conditions which are as close as possible to the conditions they will face on the day, in the actual presentation. Now, that doesn't mean that, for example, if you are speaking at a conference or in whatever context you have, that you have to go there, for example, the day before. I mean, if that's possible, that's the ideal scenario. But sometimes it's one thing we can always do is, if you know, for example, that you will be presenting while standing, don't practice or don't rehearse at home while being seated. No, stand up, because the dynamic is different. If you know that they will give you a clicker or that you will have a clicker to advance your slides, then use the clicker during the rehearsals. If instead it's an online presentation, maybe you are using Zoom or Teams or whatever, then open up your laptop, make sure that you've got the same setup that you will have in the actual online presentation. You open up Zoom or Teams, you share your slides, and you go through the presentation in either real conditions or conditions which are as close as possible to the real conditions. And that's what great presenters do. Now, again, because you mentioned examples, in the book, I shared the example of Mark Leruste. I don't know if you know him here in the UK. And he's a great speaker. He gave a TEDx talk in Cardiff many years ago, which is still the most viewed TEDx talk from that conference in Cardiff. His talk has been viewed more than 1 million times. Great presentation with a great introduction. He talks about what they don't tell you about entrepreneurship. And he rehearsed that presentation 21 times. It's not just the number itself, because, like, for example, my colleague Phil Wicknell, he also gave a TED talk which has been viewed more than 1 million times. He rehearsed 40, 50 times. So it very much depends on what works for you. There is no magic number. But Mark rehearsed 21 times. That was 21 days before the actual talk, in 21 different locations in London, to 21 different audiences. So that's the kind of commitment they had, and then the results are what we know: more than 1 million views. Also, thanks to the feedback he got from his audiences during the rehearsals.
Is there a switch that has to be flicked between practice and rehearsal? So the reason in this, but when I'm practicing, as we're now terming it, I kind of get in my own head. So if I stumble over a word, or I forget which bit's next, or I can get in my own head and sort of pull myself back. Oh, that's not right, Amy. Take another look at. And you get in your own head and you go into this loop. Whereas in rehearsing, it sounds as though what you're saying is you just power through as you would. You wouldn't stop mid-speech, would you? If you were in the middle of a presentation, oh, Amy, you've got that wrong. You'd carry on, wouldn't you? So is there a switch that needs to be flicked in order to switch between practice and rehearsal? And is that putting yourself in the conditions that are as alike to the actual presentation as possible?
More than a switch, I don't think that there should be a switch, but it's more of a gradual process. So, for example, if I need to give a presentation in a couple of weeks from now, or like 10 days from now, then I would block my diary for whatever, depending on how much time I need to rehearse. Let's say an hour per day, and I will want to rehearse, say, like 10 times for me to I don't have to memorize the message, but I need to internalize it. And there's a difference there, but you need to be able to internalize your message. You need to own your message. You need to know exactly what to say and when. You don't have to wait for the next slide to be reminded of what you are supposed to say next. But there is no switch. So that means it's a gradual thing, which means that, for example, maybe the first 3 practice sessions are what I would classify as practice. And then maybe the third one, I can give it a try and say, okay, let me try and rehearse properly now. Let's see if I can do it. And maybe I can't do it. Maybe the fourth one is still something that I would classify a practice session. And then maybe the fifth one becomes the real rehearsal. And then from the fifth one to the last one, to the 10th one, it will be a rehearsal, rehearsal, rehearsal. But this is what works for me. There's no rule. It very much depends on what works for you. But what's important is that at some point, it could be a switch if we want to think about it this way, but there has to be a change where you say, okay, so far I've been practicing. Now let me give it a try. Let me like picture myself. I want to picture myself giving this presentation, and I want to go through the whole content from the very beginning to the very end without stopping, as if there is a real audience in front of you. So you do want to make that change if you want as you practice your presentations.
It's almost the distinction between reading your lines and doing the dress rehearsal. Okay, that helps. Thank you. And so the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about was the analogy that you'd used. It's not an analogy necessarily, but you talked about the Ferrari F1 team and the pit change and the Great Ormond Street Hospital, and the fact, just talk to us a little bit about that, because that was fascinating for me. So to read about that they had you tell the story. You'll tell the story much better than me if you don't mind.
Yeah, and this is not my story. This is the story of one of our clients. So I worked with Nishita Dewan to prepare a TEDx talk that was a few years ago. And she wanted to, so her talk was about the power of serendipity and unexpected connections in the workplace. And so that was the idea. And so we know about the power of storytelling, the power of analogy. So every time there is an important message that you want to get across, that's what we've done with Nishita, but we do it all the time with our clients. Anyone should do it. You need to ask yourself, okay, is there a story that I can tell, or is there an analogy that I could use? Is there an example I can give that illustrates that point? If you do that, it's super powerful in communication, because people will remember the story or the analogy or the example, and hopefully the key point that's behind it. So in Nishita's case, she wanted to talk about the power of unexpected connections and serendipity, and she shared the story of some doctors at the Great what's it called? Maybe
Great Ormond Street Hospital.
Yeah, exactly, in London. And they were having lunch. During a lunch break, they were watching a Formula One race, and they noticed how coordinated when you do a pit stop, how coordinated the team is. Like they need to change the tires and check everything in just like 5 seconds, 7 seconds. You need to be super coordinated. And they were talking about it, and they said, well, actually, sometimes when we take patients from, and with them often we're talking about small children, we take them from one unit in the hospital to another unit. We also need to be very careful. We just have a few seconds and we need to get it right. And they said, why don't we go to Italy to speak to the Ferrari Formula One team to see whether we can learn something? And they did. They arranged the trip. They went there. They had a meeting. Thanks to that, they then revisited their own handover processes for patients going from one area of the hospital to another during certain important procedures. And thanks to that, I think the result, you may remember it better than me, but the result was that they reduced, was it mortality or like an important thing by 20%. And that was thanks to the power of just serendipity. Just because those two doctors during lunch break were watching the Formula One, and just because the TV was on. And so Nishita could have simply said, oh, serendipity is important and you never know where ideas may come from, because that was the message. But she knew that if that's all she said, most likely the audience, after a few minutes after her talk, would have forgotten the message. Whereas if you if you support your message, again, either with a story or with an example or an analogy, And it doesn't have to be an emotional story. It very much depends on, it doesn't have to be a once upon a time type of story. It very much depends on what your context is. Again, the audience, they will remember the story and the key message behind it.
So to extrapolate that further, so how did Nishita become aware of that story in order to attach it to serendipity? Is there a tactic or a trick to spotting those things?
Oh, so what happened there in that specific case was, as we worked together, that was an important message. That was the key message in our presentation. So I invited her to do some research and to think about, okay, this is the message. Often one of the things we do with our clients is brainstorming together during the sessions, in between coaching sessions. And so it's either something that you know, or it's something that you may do some research. In that case, she did some research, and or you can simply pay attention to what's around you. So often, if we pay attention to what happens in our lives, at work, personal lives, professional lives, sometimes many things happen which are, or it could be you read an article, you read a book, you listen to a podcast. There are many things, many ideas that are connected to something that you talk about in your work, in your communications, in your presentations, but we don't pay attention to it. If we do, then, for example, what I do, Emmy, is I have 2 Google documents. One is for stories and examples. One is for analogies. So every time I read a book, I listen to a podcast, I watch an interview, or just anything happens, and I hear an idea which I know is connected, and that could be a story, an example, an analogy that's connected to some of the ideas that I talk about in my work, then I move it there. And I've got over the years, it's these are documents with hundreds of ideas. But then what I can do now is, every time I want to say, okay, so for example, one of the first questions you ask me is, tell me about the 5 principles that you talk about in the book. Okay. So I said, okay, let's talk about related. Then I could go there, and then I just type related, and then the story of I told you about the story of Marie, blind people. I'm sure that story is there. So just very quickly you can. So it's a combination of doing some research, but the main thing is paying attention to what's around you, because there's always, if we think about it, there's always a story to tell.
And I think that thank you for those tips, because the Google Docs is exactly what I was looking for. I was thinking, how do you start spotting that? But I suppose it's like anything, isn't it? When it's like a muscle. If you know that you're looking for the stories and you're looking for the analogies, you'll start seeing them everywhere. For example, the Picasso's bolt he talks about in the book, I was thinking about, God, that really works for when we're working with clients on their employee value proposition. Sometimes it's not about making it complex. Sometimes it's not all
Simplify.
about the detail. Yeah,
exactly.
And so those tactics of creating a Google Doc, one for analogies and one for stories, is really helpful and probably be really valuable to listeners as well.
And it doesn't have to be complicated. Like, my doc is just 2 columns. One column is the message or the idea that I want to communicate. The second column is either the analogy or the story or the example. That's it. Very simple.
And so have you filtered that down to simple messages? So have you got sort of 5 messages that you want to get across typically, and so you look for stories and analogies that attach to those, or are there multiple messages?
There are like hundreds of all of the messages and ideas that we talk about in our line of work during webinars or our own presentations or workshops with clients or one-to-one coaching sessions. There are ideas. In the end, what we do is we share ideas, trying to drive change in the way most people and companies go about preparing, designing, and delivering their presentations. And there are many messages connected to this particular objective. So it's not just 5, it's hundreds.
And in terms of the future of presenting then, talk to us about how you see it changing. Do you think it will change with the advent of AI and as technology changes?
Okay, so everybody's talking about AI now, technology, and sometimes they do ask me the question, will artificial intelligence change public speaking forever? And Now, I think, Emmy, that the answer is no. I do think that AI in particular is having a massive impact in many things, including communication, presenting, public speaking. So the impact is there. I don't want to deny it. But here is why I don't think that it's going to change this field entirely. So, for example, Jeff Bezos said that he's often asked, what do you think is going to change in the next 10 years? And he says, nobody ever asked me, what do you think is not going to change in the next 10 years? And he thinks that the second question is much more interesting, because if you focus on the things that don't change, that's how he puts it, you will be successful. In the case of Amazon, for example, they know that 10 years from now, people will still want fast delivery, vast selection, and also cheap prices. So they know that if they keep focusing on those things, 10 years from now, they will be successful. In communication, it's the same thing. There are things that change and things that don't change. The things that change are tools and technology. Now, 50 years ago, Emmy, we didn't have PowerPoint. A few years ago, we didn't have Zoom, or for this podcast, we are using Riverside. Maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we didn't have Riverside. Or just a few months ago, a couple of years ago, we didn't have ChatGPT and all these amazing AI tools. But these tools will change. That's inevitable. But what will never change are the fundamental principles of communication. Aristotle was the first one, more than 2,000 years ago, who gave us the building blocks for persuasion, influencing others, effective communication, and he didn't have PowerPoint. So, for example, in your case, Emmy, say that you give, like 10 years from now, you give a presentation, great presentation, then somebody comes to you from the audience after the talk and they say, Emmy, that was a great talk. I just wish that your message was not so simple for me to understand. Or I just wish that your storyline was not so clear for me to follow. Or I just wish that your presentation was not so original and enjoyable. Or maybe, Emmy, great presentation. I just wish that your message was not so relevant to me and my needs. That will never happen. And it will never happen because these are the fundamental principles of communication. These are the principles I talk about in the book. Now, of course, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the AI and technology does not play a role. I use artificial intelligence, for example, every day for me, for with our colleagues, for with our clients. But what really makes a difference and what really differentiates average or normal communicators from great communicators, confident presenters, for example, are whether or not they follow the fundamental principles of communication. Thinking about this podcast, the Human CEO podcast. So for me, human is a key word. It has to be AI or technology plus human. For me, that's a very powerful combination. If we, even from a communication perspective, AI plus human is a very powerful and positive combination. But if it's just AI or technology without the human element, something fundamental is missing.
Yeah, I agree. I'm a big believer that it will amplify the human skills. It shouldn't replace them. And I don't think, I'm not an expert in AI, but I don't see it replacing the human skills anytime soon. Like you talked about Aristotle and the influencing and those fundamentals of being able to connect with an individual. I hope that's a long way off if it's ever going to happen with AI, but it has to be an amplifier rather than a replacement.
I agree, 100%.
And so in terms of connecting with the audience then, while we're on the human skills, in the book you talk about having, I can't remember the word that you used, but interacting with your audience every 10 minutes or so, 7 minutes or so. The fear that I think some people have, and when I say some people, I mean myself, but the fear of interacting with the audience sometimes come from, will this fall flat? If I say, have you got any questions? And there's a tumbleweed goes across the room. There's a fear that exists that almost holds you back from interacting. Are there strategies that you could share with us in terms of the types of interaction or how to position that interaction that will put those fears to bed, for want of a better phrase?
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't have to be complicated. So when I say that you need to interact, and then I can also talk about why that's important, but it's not really about asking like what most people do. Do you have any questions? No, that's not what I mean by interacting with the audience. And a moment of interaction is anything that you ask or do or say that's connected, very much connected to something you've been talking about up to that point in the presentation. Now, like for example, you are giving it could be like super simple. You are giving a webinar, so you are online, and you could say, so like in my case, I could talk about in a webinar one of the 5 principles. Simple. Okay, so I talk about how to simplify your message. And then I could say, okay, on a scale from, just out of curiosity, on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 means that you find it very hard to simplify your message, 10 means that you find it very easy to do that. Where are you in this spectrum? Give me a number in the chart. And then they just need to type a number in the chart. Or I could talk about how to develop a clear storyline, one of the other principles, clear. And I could talk about maybe the rule of 3, which is one of the simplest and most powerful principles in communication, the idea of communicating 3 key messages, 3 key points, no more. And then I could say, okay, could you give me just a quick exclamation mark in the chat if you can see how you can apply this principle in your own context? Just a quick exclamation mark in the chat. Now, these are just 2 very simple examples, but it doesn't have to be complicated. It could be just a quick question that you ask. It could be a moment of interaction. Maybe if you are in person, you talk about something and then you give them 30 seconds for them to share their ideas, their thoughts connected to what or maybe you pose a question and you ask them to speak to the person next to them for 30 seconds. It could be just creating some breakout rooms, either online or in person. There are many possibilities, but it doesn't have to be, do you have any questions? And the reason why that's important is because research tells us that the audience's attention drops after about 10 minutes when you are presenting in person. And Emmy, it doesn't matter how good you are as a presenter, their attention will drop after about 10 minutes. So it's as if every 10 minutes you need to buy the audience's attention back. The audience's attention is a bit like the sand in an hourglass. If you think about the sand in an hourglass, it runs out after a few minutes. But it's very easy to just flip it over and start again. With the audience, it's the same thing. And this means that as a presenter, you can, if you think about their attention, you can flip it over and start again. So it should not be up to the audience to work hard and pay attention. It should be up to you as the presenter to work hard in advance to create these moments of interaction, to keep their attention. And this is in person. Online, as we know, it's even harder to keep the audience's attention high. So the 10-minute rule becomes the 5-minute rule. So every 5 minutes, I know that most people don't do that, but if you're giving an online presentation, more or less every 5 minutes, you should be interacting with the audience.
See, those numbers are surprising to me. I would have thought that it'd be even shorter than 10 minutes or 5 minutes.
Yeah. So
in today's day and age.
Oh, okay. Right. Yeah. So yeah, it is true that now people talk about the attention span is just a few seconds. The when it comes to presenting, so maybe that's connected to things like social media and in a different context. But when it comes to presenting, provided that, of course, it very much depends on how engaging your message is, how relevant it is. But if that's the case, and that's the most important thing, then you should be able to keep their attention for about 5 minutes online or 10 minutes in person. Of course, if your message is super boring, complex, too technical, not relevant to the audience, then yes, it will be just a few seconds and they'll switch off.
But I suppose people that are in the room or that are on the virtual webinar, they've got the context as to the reason why they're there. And that's the reason why it's longer than social media.
Yeah, hopefully. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they are forced to be there. So it very much depends on what the context is. But the reason why, again, this is important because every time the audience does something, even if it's as simple as answering a question, it could be a yes or no answer. So you share an idea and then you ask a yes or no question. Sorry, you ask a question that it's just a yes or no question connected to something that you've shared, or you ask them to raise their hand if something is true, or if what you shared speaks to them. Every time they do something, even if it's just typing a quick exclamation mark in the chat, or typing a yes in the chat, typing a quick number in the chat, it means that the audience is there with you. They're listening to you and they're not doing something else.
And in the book as well, you talked about the power of using the phrase, was it for example?
Oh, yeah.
That captures the attention of people. Can you talk to us about that, please?
Yeah. So Professor Atkinson wrote a book titled Lend Me Your Ears, which is a public speaking book. And he carried out a study where during a conference, he placed two cameras. One camera was looking at the speaker and the other camera was looking at the audience. And it was fascinating. Every time the speaker said something like, either for example, or let me give you an example, or I'll give you an example, then you could see from the other camera, the audience, even if they were not paying attention before, they started paying attention. And again, that's the power of storytelling. So sometimes if you combine what we talked about before, the importance of and the power of storytelling, there's always a story to tell, and make sure that you start that story with something like, for example, I'll give you an example. Let me give you an example. Then whatever you say next, at the very least, they'll pay attention. So you've gained their attention. And then it's up to you to meet the expectations, of course.
And so that's the reason why, because people are almost anticipating a story.
Exactly, because you say, for example, they know that you are about to tell them a story, to give them an example, and our brain is hardwired to listen to stories, to enjoy them, to remember them, and that's why.
Do you think if there was ever an opportunity for you to go back to the 80s and 90s, you could go back to my school and teach this to all of our teachers? Because it's a lost art, isn't it, in terms of capturing the attention and sharing the stories. It certainly wasn't the way I was taught when I was at school. I don't know if you had a different experience, did you? What was your experience at school?
No, same experience, and it's unfortunate that if you think about schools, the education system in general, I think that this particular skill is, of course, I'm biased, but I do think that it's the single greatest skill we can muster if we want to achieve our goals, whatever they are. If you want to increase your influence and reputation, if you want to grow your business, if you want to make a bigger impact, if you want to make a positive impact in the world, if you want to build a great team, if you want to improve your organizational culture, communication is key in all of these things. And it's unfortunate that in the education system, for me, presentation skills should be a subject. It should be part of the curriculum. But apart from some exceptions, we do work with universities, for example, with a few business schools. But before that, if we think about high school, then it should be there, but it's not.
I'm going to refrain from getting on my soapbox about the education system, but I completely agree with you. Thank you for sharing all of your insights with us. Is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that I should have asked you?
Great question. It's the, you know what, Emmy, this is the question I always use at the end of my own interviews for a podcast. And I wasn't thinking about you asking me that question as well, but that's a great question. Is that, no, for me, I would go back to where we started, the misunderstanding. So I'm talking to our listeners. Please don't think that if you want to become a more confident presenter, or if you want to develop a team of confident presenters and communicators, don't think that it comes from wishful thinking or innate self-belief or natural talent. It has nothing to do with that. Remember, it comes from familiarity, preparation, and we talked about how to prepare effectively. It comes from following a certain process, which is much more than just opening up PowerPoint. And by process, I mean starting with the audience, brainstorming to identify your key messages, creating a clear storyline from the very beginning where you want to be able to capture the audience's attention to the very end with a powerful conclusion. illustrating your message effectively. If you have to, you don't have to use slides all the time, but if you do, you definitely want to avoid the typical death by PowerPoint with lots of text and bullet points. People can't read and listen at the same time. That's why in the book I mentioned the Picasso example, the ball. Also, then the last part of the process is the connection side of things with the audience. So you want to be able to make a good connection with the audience. And yes, you can do that with your delivery skills, body language, gestures, postures, eye contact. So you see, it's so much more than just opening up PowerPoint. And then confidence, 80% of your confidence will come from your ability to develop a compelling message, a message which is simple for the audience to understand, clear for them to follow, related or relevant to them and their needs, and also, why not, original and enjoyable.
Just as you were talking there, I just want to loop back to when you said about the audience, make it relatable. The presentation has to be about them, but I think often, I don't know whether it's habit or whether it's how people are taught traditionally, but you're taught to introduce yourself. And often if people have imposter syndrome, or it's just naturally what they think needs to be at the start of the presentation, you start talking about yourself and you introduce, and this is why I'm here, and this is why you should listen, or, those introductions happen. If you're relating with the audience, I get they don't care who you are, as long as the message resonates with them and it's helpful to them. But should there be a credibility piece in there? And if so, where in the order does that go?
Yes, so it should be there, but not at the very beginning. So I agree with you. Most people open their presentations by introducing themselves, and that's a mistake. In most cases, you will never be able to gain the audience's attention by making about you, by talking about who you are and what you do. So you want to start with something else. And there are many ways. In the book, I go through practical techniques for you to be able to capture the audience's attention. One very simple, a very simple technique is just you could start by saying something like, "Today I'm going to cover 3 main points." Then you briefly tell them what those 3 key messages will be, just very briefly, and then you start with you end, if you want, the opening with a promise. What's your promise? So by the end of this presentation, or by the end of this meeting, by the end of this call, you will what? What's your promise? What will they get out of that meeting or of that presentation? So that could be one way for you to, and there are many other techniques. And then after that, going back to your question, then once you've gained their attention, then you can introduce yourself. And so you want to do it after something which could be just a small paragraph. It doesn't have to take long. A good opening should be just to give another practical benchmark for our listeners. A good opening shouldn't be more than 5% of the entire duration of the presentation.
Andrea, thank you. There's as much value in the podcast, I hope, as there was in the book. It's brilliant. Definitely recommend people reading it. Thank you for joining us. It's been great to speak with you.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the Human CEO podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please help us share more leadership content by liking and subscribing. If today's episode got you thinking about unleashing the full potential of your organisation's culture, we've got a great next step for you. Take our free assessment at humanculture.scoreapp.com to see where your organisation stands and discover actionable insights to elevate your workplace culture.